Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and asking me to do this presentation because this is one of those issues I've been trying to get my head around for a long, long time, decades indeed. And this has been very good for me to have the rigor of making a presentation so that I can get these ideas straight in my own head and hopefully um, get them over to you guys as well. So starting off. A little bit about context. All of this is in the context of what we're now referring to as cyber systemics, which is a mixture of systems thinking and cybernetics, which are very closely linked and are kind of like being seen as one unit now. And basically, we start with this idea that things are not working quite clearly because the models we're using and the ideas we use to think about the world just don't work anymore. So we need new ways of thinking about things, new models, and that comes to systems thinking and cybernetics. And this is Gregory Bateson, one of my heroes. And this is something I read when I was probably at university, which has always stuck with me, that all these problems come from the way we think. And again, this thing about deep and partly unconscious levels. So this is where we start. And a very quick thing about cyber systemics. And the green arrows are a representation of how we tend to be brought up to think about things in straight lines, the whole Newtonian reductionist logical approach to the universe. And the whole idea of cyber systemics is that we leave that behind and we think rather than in terms of these green arrows in straight lines and these blue swirly interactive pictures, which is all patterns of relationships. And this phrase, patterns of relationships, I've been using for several years now, and it sort of just cropped up one time, and it's just such a very, very clear way of thinking about systems and how things interact and how things always work in cycles, always go round and round, and they're dynamic and they're interactive, and you're moving into this very complex, messy world of all these interactive systems, rather than the nice, neat Newtonian thing of saying, okay, we're only going to think about these issues. So we're moving into that world for systemics and introducing the model. Oh, yeah, this is Stafford in the 1960s. When he was a very successful businessman. When I knew him, he'd already his beard was white and his hair was long, and he was a completely different character. But he'd started developing the model basically because he was very dissatisfied with the way most traditional management worked, and he was very successful. He became a very successful consultant. But it's always important to me to stress that this was developed by a manager for managerial problems to make things work more effectively. It wasn't a theory, it wasn't an academic work. He was working as a manager, writing this stuff in the middle of the night when he got home. And so VSM is very much a practical tool. So the origins is a physiological inspiration where he started with a very, very deep study of the brain and moved on to this model, which I'm not going to go into in detail. I'm hoping most people have got a vague understanding of the VSM. A lot of it I'll go into later on, but it's important to understand that it was inspired by the way the body and the brain work. And to start off, we're going to look at this incredibly simple model, which says all organizations have these three basic parts. You have the bits that do things, which are based on the muscles and the organs. You have an environment within which it operates, and then you have some sort of control or management function, which is embedded inside the operation, teased apart like this for clarity. And then dynamic interactions between all three of them. And this three element model, operation, environment, management, are basically the core of the model. And if you move on and just make it a little bit simpler, and you say, okay, here's the three elements: environment, some sort of management control, and the operation. And inside the operation, you will see three shapes, which are all exactly the same as the system itself, but smaller. So this is a recursive model. And each of the three operational elements inside the big operational oval are interacting with their environments. So you're starting to build up the shape of the model. And we're now going to move on to another of my heroes. This is Lynn Margulis. And she did some extraordinary work on evolution, which completely rewrote the evolutionary textbook, showing that Darwin was limited in his understanding. Highly recommended if any of you want a good read. This book's called Symbiotic Planet. But she had this really beautiful phrase. This is the nicest way I've ever seen this written. She says, the tendency of independent life is to bind together and re-emerge in a new wholeness at a higher, larger level of organization. And this is kind of the key to the model that, that you look at the VSM as a cluster of parts. You start with the operational elements, the bits that are doing the work, and then you see how they bind together, how they emerge in this new wholeness that she talks about, as a larger viable system. And of course, because it's recursive, you've got viable systems coming together to create larger viable systems. And for me, this is kind of the key to the whole thing, that if you start looking at it from this point of view, it turns traditional management theory on its head. Because in the old way, you have a boss who's in charge, and he makes sure everything works properly through command and control, through people doing what they're told, through authority and obedience. And instead we say, okay, well, that's one way of looking at it, but we're going to look at it in a different way. This is based on natural systems and Lynn Margulis and Stafford's understanding of how the body and the brain work, and how a cluster of operational parts interacting with their environments can be held together to create a larger system. So this, of course, changes the whole nature of management. So M, which is normally seen as management and as people telling other people what to do, becomes sort of transforms into a meta system. And this is Stafford's, this is his definition, a collection of subsystems which looks after the operation elements so that they cohere in that totality called the viable system. So you're moving away from the management as the boss and can control to the management providing a service to the operation elements, looking after them, which is Stafford's words. So you're in a completely different way of thinking about things. So summing up the VSM, I've done this extremely rapidly. This normally takes me 2 or 3 hours, but for this talk, I wanted to get onto the other stuff. So what do we got? We got nested recursive systems. We've got an operation which works with an environment which is quite often unpredictable and hostile. We've got a meta system which holds it all together. We've got autonomy, which I'll get onto in a minute, continuous dynamic co-evolving interactions, real-time information, and then this whole question of requisite variety, which is a cybernetic concept, which says that the complexity of one system has to be in balance with the complexity of another system if it's going to work. So we're looking at this model and we're looking at it from the point of view of parts coming together into wholes, metasystems providing a service, dynamic interaction, and that's the basis of analysis, the whole system co-evolving with its environment. So that's the background. I'm sure some of you have heard all this before, but it felt important to get this clear. So now we move on to the more interesting bits. So this is the first one. This is from authority and obedience to autonomy and cohesion. So I'm putting this slide in because it explains how extraordinary the work Stafford does, because at the time he was working in the 50s and the 60s putting all this stuff together. And the dominant management theory was this guy, F.W. Taylor. And he wrote some extraordinary stuff, which I find quite horrific. And this is one of his quotes, which says, under our system, the workman is told minutely just what he is to do and how he is to do it. And any improvement which he makes upon the orders given to him is fatal to success. And the shadow of Taylorism is still with us. I mean, it still hangs over a lot of organizations, but the VSM is a completely different approach to it. So moving on to this, we then look at this model, operation, environment, and meta system now. And if you look at the horizontal, the red arrow that we've got horizontally on the screen, the operational unit is dealing with an environment which is complex, rapidly changing, probably highly competitive in the outside world, and therefore it must have as much flexibility as possible to do its job, to respond to change, to answer questions, to basically interact with its environment to provide the services it's providing. So that's very clear. And anybody that's ever worked in any organization knows that the more flexibility and the more variety, as we'd say, the better. So on the other hand, you've got the vertical arrow, and that's the meta system, which has the job of holding it all together. And obviously that's going to require some sort of intervention. And the rule that Stafford came up with, which is kind of the golden rule of viable systems, is you always maximize autonomy to provide as much flexibility as you can to the operational units. And you only limit it by system cohesion. So if there's things you need to do to hold the system together to stop it coming apart, then you can intervene, but only for system cohesion. So there's no micromanagement, there's no command and control, there's no sense of the Taylorism that you're telling people exactly how to do their job. You're coming up with a completely different approach, which is not authoritarian, but it's about maximizing autonomy. And there's a whole range of really beautiful, elegant approaches inside the viable system model to make that happen. So this kind of clarified it for me, because this is I went to a talk a while ago, and this came up, and the question is, what does a manager expect from his staff? If we're talking autonomy, we're talking viable systems, we're talking non-authoritarian approaches. And the guy who came up with this saying is Miles Davis. And apparently, if you join Miles Davis's jazz band and you said to him, Miles, you're the great jazz band leader, and we respect you, what do we do? And his answer was, surprise and delight me. And for me, this really sums up the relationship between the meta system and the operation, that you're looking for surprise and delight, and not for people to do what they're told. So that's the first conclusion we come to. There I think we got 4 conclusions in the talk. So basically, this just sums up everything we just said. Operational units need all the flexibility and variety that they can muster. So metasystemic interventions must be minimal, which is something that comes up in Stafford's writing all the time. So we're basically moving from an authoritarian approach to management to this idea of autonomy and cohesion, which again fits in very beautifully with the Lynn Margulis approach of living systems coming together and emerging in a greater wholeness. So that's the first one. Oh yeah, and there's a little picture of Miles just to cheer me up. Okay, secondly, from representative democracy to distributed peerocracy. And this follows on pretty much exactly from the previous argument, that if you're talking about an operation dealing with an environment and you've come to the conclusion that it's just not working, that the environment is far too complex for the operation to deal with, the question is, how do you create more capacity, more variety in the operation to deal with the environment? And at the community level, at the neighborhood level, it becomes absolutely clear from these kind of arguments when you look at the the complexity and the capacity we've got, that everybody needs to be involved in their local environment. That we get down to the lowest level in the system, we're talking recursions, and at the lower level, we're all operational units, and everybody has to get involved. And this whole thing of democracy, of representative democracy, where you vote every 5 years and then sit back and expect everybody else to sort out all your problems, just becomes completely unworkable. And it needs everybody to get involved. And I came across another example of this in a book called The Age of Resilience by Jeremy Rifkin. And that's a quote from his book. Representative democracy is beginning to make way for distributed peerocracy as a younger generation become active players in the governance of their bioregions. And he argues pretty much from a very different point of view, but coming to exactly the same conclusion, that everybody has to get involved and get stuck in and not expect people that we vote in to do all the stuff for us. So that's the second conclusion, moving from democracy to peerocracy. Thirdly, we're moving from pyramidal hierarchy to nested recursions. And we've already talked slightly about recursions. As you can see in this diagram, we've got one big viable system, and then at 45 degrees to that, 3 operation units inside those, and then vertically inside those. And this goes down and down and down the rabbit hole, smaller and smaller viable systems. And you can go up and up and up to the whole planet. And you've got all these different levels of recursion. And you can draw it like this. So you take any one viable system and you can tease out of it the next level of recursion down. And it gives you what people refer to as the whole picture, not the big picture, but the whole picture. And this is something that Stafford did in Chile. For those of you who don't know, there's a very famous story of Stafford being invited by Salvador Allende in 1971 to apply these ideas to the entire social economy of Chile. And the first thing he did was to map the recursions, which is the first job you always do when you're doing a VSM job. So it goes all the way up from the worker up to the whole nation. And this is one particular recursion. You can go down several, because each time you break down, you've got several viable systems inside each recursion. And this was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 levels of recursion. And because it's recursive, the same principles of organization, and again, the whole picture of a nation. So the implications of this are actually quite staggering. All the viable systems are autonomous. At every level of recursion, you've got viable systems which need to be autonomous, and therefore the structure is something that Eleanor Ostrom talks a lot about. It's polycentric, that it's not taking orders from above. Each viable system in each recursion needs to have a level of autonomy, and it's focused on fulfilling its purpose by the way it interacts with a particular environment. And we've done a lot of work on climate change, and it becomes very clear that the only way we're going to deal with this is to define the recursions in terms of the ecology in which they exist. And this opens new possibilities. And as an example of this, here is the Great Lakes Basin. Now, what's happening is that because there are issues which can only be dealt with at this level of the Great Lakes Basin, lots of regions in Canada and the US have started to come together in order to deal with these particular decisions. And it's a beautiful example of a recursion, of a viable system at a recursion, because you can go from, as in Chile, Stafford went through all the basic economic ones through firms and trade sectors and so on and so forth. But you can do just the same through ecological ones. And you come up with recursions like this, which you'd hope would exist in order to create a regenerative economy. Now, that it almost certainly doesn't. It's much more concerned with profit and the old financial imperatives. But if you could imagine this as a viable system whose job is to create a regenerative economy, then you could start doing all sorts of really fascinating things. And what becomes clear is that some decisions can only be taken at this level. And then these need to filter down through all the lower recursions in order to make things, to put things into practice. So again, this is a completely new way of thinking about it. So the conclusion are, if we want to deal with ecological issues, the recursion should be based on ecosystems. All viable systems have to have their autonomy. They must be, and there's this lovely term, unleashed, which I find myself using more and more, in order to deal with specific problems at that level of recursion. And again, at the neighborhood level, this means that every individual has to be part of the solution. So in order to have the capacity to deal with your environmental problems in your community, you need the resources and the autonomy in order to do that. And that refers to that particular level of recursion. So recursive governance opens up all these new ways of thinking about it. So that's the third one. Fourth one, from competition to collaboration. So for those of you who know the model, you will know that there is a system 3, which is highlighted by the red circle here. And its job is to oversee the operation, to look at all the stuff going on within the operation, which I've labeled 1A, 1B, and 1C. And its job is to look for synergies so that the whole thing operates more effectively than the parts working in isolation. And this is actually a quote from Stafford. System 3 role is conceived as fundamentally synergistic. And a lot of people who haven't read Stafford's work very closely see System 3 much more as a control role. And in fact, there are quite a lot of papers written where you look at System 3 and it says control. And for me, this misses the whole point of System 3 working and encouraging autonomy at the operational level, while at the same time having the mandate to conceive of, to look for synergies in consultation with the Systems 1, and to come up with new ways of working, which bring more out of the whole thing. There's also a System 3 also has a legal and policy issue, but that's not the one we're most concerned of with the moment. So this is all direct quotes from Stafford's work. He sees System 3 as, well, synergistic behavior derives from the recognition of mutual support between the operation elements. So he talks about synergy, mutual support, and intending to lead to a higher payoff for the whole system rather than the sum of independently active elements. So it's very much a collaborative description. And this whole thing about the various people in System 3 in a company having this synoptic view that they sit above. The meta system is, meta means over and above, in a logical sense, not in a sense of power and status. But you look over it and you take this synoptic view, looking at the whole interactive cluster of System 1s, and say, how can we do this better? And he's this lovely phrase he uses in a video he made when he came back from Chile. And he says, System 3 creates an explosion of potential. And when you're working with this model, and you got all your System 3s clear, and your System 1's clear, and you see how they interact, and you talk to the System 3 people, and you put this in terms of synergy, you can do remarkable things. It just works extraordinarily well. So if you think of a higher level of recursion, where the Systems 1 are small businesses, there will always be, they will all come together. The model hypothesizes that all these businesses can come together into a higher viable system, and there will be a System 3 which will be looking at how they collaborate for their mutual benefit. So in other words, the model provides the framework for the design of a collaborative economy. And this is an example of how it's done. This is something I came across some years ago, which quite knocked me out at the time. This area of northern Italy around Bologna called Emilia Romagna. And 4.5 million people, there are 15,000 cooperatives in this area. They provide 40% of regional GDP, employ 200,000 people. And in the 1970s, it was Italy's poorest region. And today it's its most prosperous. And if you look at the figures, they're 30% higher than the European average in their individual income. And as well as being the most prosperous, it's got the lowest inequality in Italy. So small cooperatives, highly specialized, technologically sophisticated, world-class products, and they cluster into networks. So the way it works, one co-op will see an opportunity for bidding for a large contract. And this contract is way bigger than its own capacity to fulfill it. So what they do is they get in touch with other co-ops and they say, we want to bid for this big contract. We can do the first part. We need you to do the second part. We need another bunch of people to do this part. And they put together a consortium of cooperatives and they bid for the contracts. They quite often win, and they quite often bid against large multinationals. And it's been enormously successful. And once the job's done, once the contract's fulfilled and the products have been made and shipped off, then the whole thing just fades away. And it always reminds me of those movies you see about slime molds, how these slime molds come together and they make these slug-like creatures which move around in a coherent form, and then gradually, after they've fulfilled their particular job, they break down into slime molds again. And of course, then what happens is another co-op will get another contract. And so these consortiums are coming together. And of course, from our point of view, this coming together as a higher level of recursion and forming this new wholeness, which Lynn Margulis talks about, which is a larger viable system, does the job and then breaks down. And you can just see these collaborative networks being enormously successful. All based on trust and reciprocity. Most contracts just with a handshake. All the finances raised by individual co-ops, guaranteed by the consortium, and it's a very fundamental part of the community. And this phrase down the bottom came from John Rostakis, who's a cooperative development guy from Canada who did one of the early studies on this, and he points out that this extraordinary success of going from the poorest part of Italy to the most prosperous, the success comes from a cluster of ideas and practices that make it the antithesis of the corporate model of success as prescribed by mainstream economic ideology. So a completely different way of doing things, completely like the antithesis of the way we've been taught to believe that capitalism should work, and enormously successful. So, final conclusion, at all levels of recursion, there'll be a system 3, which is fundamentally synergistic. And at all levels, it's the job of the next level to ensure mutual support and collaboration. And again, this is the framework for the design of a collaborative economy. So, putting all this together, what have we got? We got autonomy rather than authority. We've got the need for creative, innovative, unleashed individuals at all levels throughout the system, but particularly at the lower levels. We've got levels of recursion, each with specific environments which give them particular jobs to do, which can only be done at that level in an autonomous way. We've got collaboration everywhere. And we've got the need for continuous involvement of everyone from neighborhoods upwards. So clearly, the final conclusion, this is entirely different from pretty much everything that we're doing at the moment. So at the moment, it's all authority and obedience, minimal government intervention. And of course, if you look at the recursions, there's times the government has to intervene, ruthless competition, representative democracy, and basically pretty much all elements of the way we organize ourselves at the moment are different from what the VSM suggests. And that's it.